Our first speaker is Mr. Brian Harris, the Implementation Coordinator for the Nutrient Management Program, which oversees the agriculture and urban sections of the program. Brian joined the MDA, or Maryland Department of Agriculture, in 2002 as the Nutrient Management Specialist serving farmers in Frederick, Carroll, Howard, and Montgomery counties, working with both implementation and certification and licensing programs sections of the program. And prior to joining the MDA, Brian worked for the University of Maryland Extension as a nutrient management consultant in Carroll County. He's a graduate of the University of Maryland Institute of Applied Agriculture. So today he's going to be presenting on changes to nutrient application regulations. So with that, I'd like to welcome Brian, and I'll turn the screen over.
Okay. Thank you much. Just want to give everybody a brief update. The first part of the presentation is going to be a little bit of an update on some projects, the Phosphorus Management Tool, and some projects that MDA has been working on the last 2 years with some of the soils data and now the tier group data. So with that, we'll go ahead and move to talking about the Phosphorus Management Tool regulations. Just want to remind everybody that there is an immediate ban on phosphorus on fields over 500 FIV. And that is all sources of phosphorus, whether it's organic or chemical fertilizer, okay? Just a brief overview of the Phosphorus Management Tool. It's a 7-year phase-in approach to that. The regulations became effective June 8th of 2015. And right now, as consultants are developing plans for we're past 2016, but writing plans for 2017, we need to run both the PSI and the PMT when developing nutrient management plans. We need to provide the farmer with potential management changes to be required under the Phosphorus Management Tool. Consultants will calculate an operator's average soil PFIV and report their tier group to MDA, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. All right. Again, the Phosphorus Management Tool is the PMT, changes management requirements for farms that are required to use the tool. Again, it's I kind of look at it as a revision of the phosphorus site index and has the latest science that goes into that. With subsurface drainage being the primary driver, mostly affects management on the eastern shore and kind of coincides with some of the poultry operations with high soil P levels, okay? On the western side of the bay, we're going to be looking at distance to surface water and slopes that would affect farms in other parts of the state, on the side of the bay, western side of the bay. Again, the PMT builds in incremental change, especially for operations now scoring high, greater than 100 in the PMT calculation. All right. Over the last 2 years now, MDA started out in 2015 collecting soil phosphorus data across the state for all fields for all the phosphorus levels across the state. Okay, it was part of the regulation requirements of the PMT, and it's required to be done once every 6 years that this would be done. Okay, data will be used to identify the phosphorus fertility index values levels across the state and by county. Data gathered from this was basically collected from your consultants and certified operators. So you all that are listening in today submitted this information to the department. It was submitted anonymously, and consultants that submitted that information had to submit 2 different things. One was the soil P data, and the other was the list of names of operators that went along with that. Okay, so to date, just to give you an idea where we were, we had to prepare a report for a legislative hearing back in January. So this was the day before that hearing happened, January 17th. We had a total acreage of 1,277,930 acres statewide. To date, acres submitted is 1,083,552 acres. So basically, I'm going to say we got about 85% of the reported information across the state. So those number of fields submitted equal right now at 73,647. That number is going up a little bit each day as we collect more of this data and go around and through our review processes and so forth and get that information. All right. But just to show you that the PFIV value less than 150 is 79.3%. Okay. PFIVs between 150 and 499 is 19.1% statewide. PFIV values greater than 500 is 1.6% statewide. So what does that mean? Basically, 79.24% of the acreage statewide will not be impacted by the PSI or the PMT based on their current soil test levels. Okay. It represents 858,623 acres that are less than 150. 20.76% represents 224,927 acres that are greater than 150 FIV. And as I mentioned before, we're still working with getting some of this information, and we're getting it through follow-up with our consultants and farm operators and so forth to get the remaining information. So MDA continues to work with that and take incremental steps to obtain any remaining information. Just to give a little comparison, I pulled out Western Maryland, which we're looking at that being Allegheny, Carroll, Frederick, Garrett, and Washington counties. And again, all this data was done on January 17th. We're looking at 354,432 acres in that area, with 273,290 acres being submitted. So right now we're looking at about 77.1% being reported for 24,021 fields. Those fields less than 150, FIV is 92.07%. Okay. PFIV of 150 to 499 is 7.83%. And greater than 500 is 0.10%. Now, so to sum that up, in that part of the state on Western Maryland, those counties, we'd be looking at 92% of the acreage in Western Maryland would not be impacted by the PSI or the PMT. Again, it represents 251,621 acres that are below 150. 7.93% represents 20,525 acres that are above 150 PFIV. Now, we're going to change it a little bit. We're going to go to the lower eastern shore of Maryland, which is Somerset, Wycomico, and Worcester counties, just to put a little perspective to the differences across the state. We're looking at 155,770 acres with a total of 140,000 being submitted, almost 141,000, about 90.33% reported. Those fields that are less than 150, we're looking at 30% of those fields being less than 150. Those fields being 150, or those fields being 150 to 499, we're looking at 58.85%, and those fields over 500 being 11.14%. So on the lower shore, about 30% of the acreage in the lower shore counties of Maryland will not be impacted by the PSI or PMT. And we're looking at that representing about 42,217 acres. 70% of the fields, 98,486 acres, are above 150 PFIV in those counties. Now, we do have this on our website is information about the statewide across the counties to give you a little bit of overview of all the counties. But I wanted to compare just those two in this presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about last year, and again, we got a request about poultry litter land application, and the concern that there was this huge excess of manure that couldn't be utilized. And we did a comparison using our AIR data, Annual Implementation Report data, that's submitted by our farm operators. And we determined, looking at 2015, about 383,949 tons of poultry litter are collected, which is collected and able to either be moved off the farm or spread on a field. All right. So we took that number, 383,949. We divided that by a typical application rate of 2 tons per acre and says, okay, we need, 191,975 acres to spread that manure on at 2-ton rate. So when we looked at this, we looked at the upper shore, the mid shore, and the lower shore. Again, we looked at the percentages that were below 150. We didn't even consider anything that was 150 or greater that may or may not come out low on the PSI or PMT. It's strictly everything below 150. And basically what we're looking at is on the upper shore, we got 245,000 acres available to us. The mid shore, 184,740 acres available to us. And on the lower shore, about 39,664,000. Now, I still have the 25%. I was conservative on that number when we developed this, for a total of 469,000 acres. And I think it's important to note that, we do have acreage to spread this manure on. The manure can be utilized in the state of Maryland, and be utilized according to plans. Again, we didn't take into account anything from Western Maryland. I think we need to look at, the issue being a distribution type of problem, a concentration from a concentrated area to a less concentrated area of where we're going. So this was used in the legislature as well at one point in time last year. So back to the Phosphorus Management Tier Group. Not all operations will implement the PMT at the same time. I'm sure many of you have heard this before, but we wanted to go over it again just as a review. Timing is determined by individual operators' average soil PFIV. Basically, we add the PFIV of all fields above 150 and divide the number of those fields out. It's not a weighted average. It was not a weighted average. It's a straight average. All right. After the average is computed, the operator is assigned a tier group, tier A, B, or C. This is done once by your consultant when you get your nutrient management plan developed. It's done once, and it tells you which tier you're going to be in and when you will implement the phosphorus management tool. All right. Now, part of those regulations did require the department to collect tier group information, and that's still an ongoing project as well. That just started this past fall of 2016. And to date, we got 1,661 operations that have reported. All right. It represents one or more fields being 150 or greater. All right. It represents 11,769 fields that's been reported so far. Only those fields transition to the phosphorus management tool. So anything below 150 does not get put into that. All right. And I also think it's important to point out that some of these operators may only have one field on the farm that was 150 or greater, and that became their tier group for that field. So I think that's kind of important to note as we go forward. All right. It also represents 187,000 acres, almost 188,000. All right. So when we talk about tier group C, which that group is our average soil PFIV greater than 450 FIV, they begin transition management phase 1 in 2018. It's a 5-year schedule to do that, which is 2018 to 2022. All right. And in that group, we have 96 operations reported for about 734 fields being reported. 10,894 acres reported. 6% of that is the report of the reported operations, is what that equates to. Our average soil PFIV for tier group B is PFIV of 300 to 450. Begins transition management phase 1 in 2019, and there's a 4-year schedule. Currently, we have 252 operations that would fall into that for about 2,815 fields, which would equal 54,271 acres, about 15% of the total reported operations. And then tier group A which is our soil PFIV of 150 to 300, begins the transition management phase 1 in 2020. It's a 3-year schedule from 2020 to 2022. 1,313 operations reported, 8,220 fields reported. It's 122,705 acres reported for about 79% of those reported operations. So you can see where the largest amount is going to fall in. All right, just as a reminder of this, our transition phase 1 for Tier C starts in 2018, and we can do that over here. Then they start transition management 2 in 2020, and then to PMT in 2022. Okay, everybody's fully implementing PMT in 2022. All right. For Tier Group B, we have our TM1 starting in 2019, TM2 for 2 years, and then the PMT. And then when you come out here to Tier Group A, which is 150 to 300, you got Transition Management 1 to 2 to PMT in that 3-year period. Just to point out, there is provisions in the regulations that could potentially add time if services are not adequate. There is a Phosphorus Management Advisory Committee that advises the department of where those resources are and so forth, and they'll be the ones involved in making and being part of that decision. But the bottom line is potentially there could be a year added to this whole process if that committee and the department all feel that there's a need for that. All right. Just kind of wanted to point out here, these are phases of transition phase 1 to 2 to PMT. If you're in the low category with your PMT score, then you can do a nitrogen base not to exceed 3-year crop removal in phase 1. Transition phase 2 would be 3-year crop removal, and PMT a 3-year crop removal. If you're in the medium category, you start at a 3-year crop removal of P, and then a 2-year and a 1-year crop removal. And if you're in the high area, you're at a 1-year crop removal to a 50% in phase 2 to no additional P at that point in time when you reach PMT, full PMT implementation. So basically, if you're looking at this chart diagonally, it gets more restrictive as you go down across the chart to work with that. Hopefully, MDA is currently still working on a fact sheet to kind of interpret some of these categories and work with some of these categories a little bit. Hopefully, we can get that buttoned up here in the next few weeks and hopefully have it together by summer so that folks writing fall plans can certainly have those categories together and work with that. All right. Wanted to go into a little bit about nutrient application setbacks. This has been going around on a lot of our presentations, just as a quick drawing of our 10-foot no application setback zone, which would be right in here in this area. And then we have our directed application zone here, which would be the additional 25 feet there. And if you're broadcasting, completely broadcasting, you would be at a 35-foot setback from surface waters. Just wanted to point out a couple things about nutrient application setbacks. Consultants, certified operators do need to address the setbacks. COMAR 1520.08.05H states that consultants have to address the timing of nutrient application following the information in Section 1D of the Nutrient Management Manual. Okay. Now, we have also worked this in with our setbacks, talking about MDA has a template available on its website. And you can also do it in your own wording too. You can either use that template or your own wording, just indicating to the farmer where these setbacks are in place and based on the management that the operator is using as to what that setback would be. Just wanted to point out that surface water setbacks need to be shown on the maps. The 10-foot setback, which is a known nutrient application zone, redefines the field boundaries for the fields that have surface water present. And field boundaries are required to be shown on the map. So that needs to be addressed in the nutrient management plans as well. This is a blown up version. It's a little small there. I'm not going to read everything to you on that. It basically covers all the descriptions of the setbacks, but the charts there, we're looking for the farm name. Is there surface water present? Yes or no? The fields that would be requiring any kind of setback, and depending whether you have livestock or whether we're just doing directed application or broadcast. Again, this is a template that we've put together to utilize to help guide the process a little bit, or you can put it in your own words, and also with using the map between your cover letters and maps, just as long as the operator's aware of what those setbacks are and where they are. Okay. MDA went through the process of changing some of the nutrient application requirements this past fall. It's been a pretty lengthy process to go through. So this is the overview of what we did, and then I'll step through the process of the nutrient application document and go from there. All right. So one of the things that we did is manure applied in the spring and fall is no longer required to be incorporated into the soil. This covers the period March 1 through December 15th with some caveats to this, and we'll have a little bit more on that on the next slide. Fall spreading dates reflect September 10th to December 15th statewide across the entire state. It's no longer an east or west of the bay date split. Manure or any fertilizer containing nitrogen or phosphorus cannot be applied from December 16th through February 28th. Spreading can resume on March 1st, which we're quickly approaching, unless it's recommended in the Nutrient Management Manual. For example, sod production, greenhouse crops, and vegetable crops, or in the case of the press release that went out back the middle of February here, small grains at Green Up was allowed to go out and apply chemical fertilizer and nitrogen and phosphorus to their crops at that time. However, manure did have to wait till March 1st. And an emergency spreading provision was put in under winter application has been added to provide situations where we have an emergency to be able to deal with that emergency. And we'll talk about that a little bit more under the prohibition of manure application. Nutrient application, the nutrient sources are addressed separately. Chemical fertilizers in terms of our commercial fertilizers, organic fertilizers, manure, sludge, processing waste, etc. Need to follow our recommendations for crops in Maryland Nutrient Management Manual, Section 1B, or any of those sections in there that have crop recommendations in it. Okay. And then apply nutrients as close to plant uptake as possible. All right. So our spring and summer application began. Our dates are the same, March 1 through September 9th. We can apply nutrients for an existing crop or a crop to be planted, either during this time period or in the fall. Here's a caveat that I wanted to point out. Organic nutrients shall be injected or incorporated as soon as possible, but no later than 48 hours after application. except those farm operations that choose to manage their farms to obtain the benefits of no-till farming. Now, MDA has taken the broad stroke of the brush when it comes to no-till, and that is, if you do a little bit of tillage in the fall, to work down stalks or something, then you're probably going to be, and if you're going to plant in the fall and apply manure, then you'd have to incorporate it in the fall. If you're going to come around then in the spring and you're going to, even if you do a little tillage in the fall to control stalks, for example, and to work down crop residue, and then you're going to come back in the spring and plant that field again in corn, for example, on a no-till basis, then we would not require you to incorporate in that situation. So we're working with you on basically a per crop basis on that. If you're no-tilling that crop, then you would not have to incorporate. If you are if you're a farm operator or you're an operation that typically tills in your manure, then you would still be required to do it in that 48-hour time frame. There is a provision that was put into place that MDA reserves the right to require incorporation of organic nutrient sources on a case-by-case basis. That was added to the new regulations, and it's pretty much what the department would be using in a situation of a complaint basis in dealing with some of the complaints that we get from time to time. We do get complaints. I'm not going to get into all the specifics about that, but it is there for the department to use at that point in time. I think we want to also point out that it was also added that nutrient application is prohibited if the ground is frozen 2 inches deep or snow covered 1 inch deep. That was added to your spring time frame as well. All right. Our fall nutrient applications starting in the fall of 2017 is September 10th through December 15th statewide. All right. Again, we can apply our chemical fertilizer application and apply those only for an existing crop or a crop to be planted during that time period. As a general rule, we need to follow the NNP rate recommendations in the Maryland Nutrient Management Manual. Our accepting poultry litter, we can apply organic nutrients for an existing crop or a crop to be planted either during this period or the following spring before June 1. Again, poultry litter is a stackable material and therefore would have to be stacked if you cannot apply it into a crop that's planted in the fall. It does say we can apply poultry litter only if for an existing crop or a crop to be planted during this time period. Again, we did put on there the organic nutrients shall be injected or incorporated as soon as possible, but no later than 48 hours after application, except those farm operations choosing to manage their farms to obtain the benefits of no-till farming. And again, I think we have to look at that and understand the department was looking at that based on all the soil health information that's out there. And certainly a lot of the comments that were coming back to the department was part of the reasoning for making some of these changes. Again, we still have in there that MDA reserves the right to require that incorporation in the fall on a case-by-case basis. And at this point, I think it's only, the department's only going to look at that on a complaint basis. All right. We need to remember that if we're applying nutrients in the fall, we need to apply them to crop either a pasture land, hay land, or other acreage under vegetative cover. We cannot apply nutrients to fallow ground. There has to be some sort of cover crop or crop out there to take up these nutrients and to work with it. All right. Again, I mentioned the fallow cropland must be planted in a cover crop as soon as possible after nutrient application and no later than November 15th. Now, I realize we did extend it a month, the time period a month, but if you're going to do any planting of a fall crop, it needs to be in by November 15th and established, and ideally, hopefully before that. But we need to make sure, and if you're working with operators and so forth, and those of you that are certified operators, you certainly need to, think about your fall manure needs and what your situation is going to be while you're working with your operators in your operation, so that you can plan if you do need a little bit of room to go with additional manure in the fall to have that vegetative cover available to you. All right. And no, I don't know what the cover crop rules are going to be at this point, so that's a totally different program, and they kind of work with their sets of rules through the match program. But regardless of that, as a nutrient management side of things, you need to plan for your situation without that. All right. In the fall, we have it in there that you can base your rate on the phosphorus rate on the recommendation for the fall seeded crop or the crops, and for crops planted for the following spring before June 1 may not exceed the 1-year pea removal rate, need to abide by any of the PSI or pea site index or PMT provisions, and do not exceed 50 pounds of plant available nitrogen at any one point. So whichever one you hit first is where you're going to be. All right. And if we're on a nitrogen-based rate, again, those recommendations are for a fall seeded crop, crops to be planted the following spring before June 1. Again, something that changed in here from the 2012 version of the regs to now is there's no longer a 50% option there. It was strictly that was taken out, and it's now no more than 50 pounds of plant available nitrogen per acre can be applied in the fall. So that was a change as well. So when we start starting in the 2017 winter is December 16th through February 28th statewide. Okay. Chemical fertilizer applications. Winter application of chemical fertilizer containing NP is not allowed, with exceptions to small grains and perennial forage crop nitrogen application at green up, which is why the press release was put out in February there. Greenhouse production, some vegetable and small fruit crops. Again, all the recommendations need to follow recommendations in the Maryland Nutrient Management Manual. Organic nutrients, we want to talk about organic nutrient applications. Organic nutrients with NP may be applied only if. Now I want to distinguish, I'll talk about it here, but then we'll talk about it at Prohibition. As many of you know, we've passed that July 1, 2016 point in the 2012 regulations that required manure storage and so forth to be in place for those operations greater than 50 animal units. But we still have operations out there with less than that are still able to abide by these requirements here. And that is organic storage capacity will be exceeded by March 1, winter application restriction ends before that, okay? So those operations can still work with this situation. Nutrient source is non-stackable, so all stackable manures are not part of this application. And there's no other reasonable way to manage it. And again, we have to follow recommendations in the Nutrient Management Manual. I think it's important to note, I'll go down through this list of some of our things that we have to abide by in the winter. We do not apply to frozen ground 2 inches deep, saturated or snow-covered ground 1 inch deep. Again, saturated wasn't, saturated is what it is. Snow cover is defined as 1 inch of snow on the ground. We do not apply to slopes greater than 7%. We need to apply our nutrients at the lowest rates and over the largest amount of acreage possible. We need to apply our nutrients on vegetative cover. We do not, the base application rate, or the max, is do not exceed the 1-year phosphorus removal rate for the next harvested crop or exceed 50 pounds of plant available nitrogen. That is a change. We've added the 50 pounds of nitrogen in there in the winter to not add 50 pounds or more nitrogen in the wintertime. Okay, so whichever one you hit first in that situation is where you would be. Also, it was added that a setback of 100 feet from all surface waters will be maintained. So that was an addition. Basically, we expanded the setback to protect water quality further in these situations. Any winter applied organic nutrients will be deducted from your spring recommendations. So anything that you apply in the winter time will come off of your next crop in your nutrient management plan at a 1-for-1 situation credit of nitrogen and so forth in those situations. All right, now when I was mentioning the winter prohibition, that after July 1, 2016, a person may not make winter application of nutrient source to ag land. We're past that period of time. We also realized, it was also, as part of the changes, we mentioned this emergency spreading provisions, and this is where it comes into play in these operations now that already are at this July 1, 2016. They have more than 50 animal units, and therefore the manure storage, liquid manure storage or something comes to the point of an imminent overflow. We have to be able to work with that. And that's where the emergency provisions come in, and we'll go into that later. But prohibitions from winter application will start after February 28th, 2020 for smaller facilities. And that being a dairy or livestock operation with fewer than 50 animal units, a municipal wastewater treatment plant with a design flow capacity of less than 500,000 gallons. All right. All right, there are some exceptions to this winter prohibition. Again, we mentioned the perennial crops and nitrogen application at greenhouse production, some vegetables and small fruit crops. And again, we need to follow the nutrient management manual in this case. All right. Again, there is a provision in the regs for operators to contact MDA well before they get into a situation of an imminent overflow. So we'll talk about the emergency provision here. Applications required in an emergency situation due to an imminent overflow of a storage facility only applies to on-farm generated organic fertilizer. So it's on-farm generated material only. If you work with operators or are an operator that imports material into your farm, it does not apply to that. All right. It also does not apply to biosolids and food processing wastes. And we will still continue to work with operators and move them forward to enter into some agreement of intent with the Soil Conservation District or a private entity that is a certified technical service provider approved by NRCS. We're looking for operators to continue to work with MDA and resolve their storage needs. Now, by changing the dates in the fall month, that may change some things for a few operators out there that may have previously needed to spread and may have enough storage at this point. But there's still situations where we need to have storages built and so forth. So we'll still continue to work with those operators on that. Some of this agreement hasn't been worked out yet, but I know we're working with our local districts. All of our specialists are working with the operators and the districts at that point to know what their operators are doing in that situation. Typically, if they're working with the Soil Conservation District and have an agreement with them, we will continue to work with them favorably with implementation at that point in time. And then it only becomes an issue if that operator would no longer be working towards that. Okay. Again, with the emergency provisions, we want the operator shall contact their regional nutrient management representative for guidance. So contact your regional offices. They will let MDA headquarters know who's contacted them and so forth, because we are getting asked all the time, how many of these calls are we getting, and for what reasons? And some are very legit reasons. You know, an emergency is what it says. It's an emergency. We've had a couple situations where water pipes have broken in a barn or something and caused an issue with the manure storage facility. You know, that's certainly an emergency situation. It's a little hard to plan for that. But again, those rates of application are going to follow right back to the winter application guidelines, that those rates may not exceed the 1 year pea removal rate or 50 pounds of plant available end of the next harvested crop. Again, any winter applied organic nutrients will be deducted from your spring recommendations. Applications need to be made into existing vegetative cover. Applications prohibited from land with a slope greater than 7%, and a setback of 100 feet need to be maintained. So with that, we'll go on to talking about temporary stockpiling a little bit. And, you know, again, some of this stockpiling was set up. The original document had stockpiling guidelines in it around poultry litter. So that's where some of this wording and terminology comes from. So we want to coordinate with our integrators to schedule cleanouts as close to spring planting as possible, as much as you can do that. I know the cleanout schedules and how they do it has changed over the years a little bit. Another point to remember is that if you have storage on the farm, you need to use your existing storage before stockpiling material in the field. So those that have poultry litter storage and or solid manure storages and so forth need to use that storage facility before you stockpile in the field. Field stockpiles must be applied to crops no later than the next spring planting. Now, we kind of have interpreted that it depends when you start that stockpile. If it's in the fall, it needs to go in the spring. If it's in the summer, then it's probably the next, you know, you got a little bit of time there. And we will work with composting operations, a true composting operation, but they need to provide that documentation that they're truly composting. It is a process. It's not something you just make a pile and let it go. So again, some of the things in there is you need to have a 35-foot vegetative buffer between the stockpile and the surface water irrigation or treatment dishes. All right. If no vegetative buffer or stockpile, then it needs to be 100 feet away. We need to be 100 feet on flat ground away from wells, springs, and wetlands. At least 300 feet away from a well located down gradient. We need to be outside areas prone to flooding and ponding, and 200 feet away from residents outside the operator's property. All right. We need to stack and peak the poultry litter and similar materials at least 6 feet high. Stockpile at the same location rather than locate a new one elsewhere. Materials shall be stockpiled to prevent nutrient runoff. Thoroughly scrape or clean the site of materials and apply it to your crop, and then restore the site to its original condition with seed, and seed with grass or an agronomic crop, depending on what your situation is. And then with that, I'll end there with the overview of the regulations.
Well, thank you very much, Brian. So we did have a question, and I think this is in regards to the incorporation or no incorporation. And the question was, what about hay and pasture ground?
You are not required to incorporate on hay and pasture land. And another thing that will be in place as well, it's going to be more of an MDA policy, and that is if you have highly erodible land, you do not have to incorporate.
Okay. That makes sense. We had some people who were asking because that was in a previous guidance document.
Right.
But that, wasn't in the actual regulation. So that's a good thing. Now I have another question coming in here. Some other things. Did the press release that came out in mid-February, did that allow chemical N on forage crops, or is it just small grains?
It was just small grains at that time.
Just small grains, okay.
Yes.
And if a producer rents land and the owner will not allow the collection of a store or building of a storage facility of manure, what happens then?
I think MDA would work with that person on a case-by-case basis in that situation. And, there's other details that go into that, so I'm not going to fully answer that question.
Okay. And another question came in from the Eastern Shore. Is there going to be any kind of exceptions to the PSI PMT for organic farmers?
I'm not aware of any at this point.
Okay. And looks like we have a couple more questions coming in, so we'll give a second for those. Next question is, what about manure lab tests for small animal operations, utilizing book values? What about that?
MDA is currently working on a policy, but the policy is not finalized on what we're going to do with those small operations just yet. So right now, according to regs, those operations still need a manure analysis in place at this time. But MDA is looking at a policy and working on a policy to look at that situation a little closer.
Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank
It was always enlightening to see kind of what the updates have done and what you guys are actually looking at.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.